Hello, and welcome to our quick bite on avoiding digital chaos. This is Nick Eckstein, who is an associate professor in the Department of History, and I'm Tess, and I'm from the library. What we're going to be doing is talking to you about how to avoid digital chaos. So, how to create a plan and manage your information in a clever way, and how to avoid getting bogged down in too much literature, basically. So, to use this webinar, use the chat box under here to ask you questions, and we'll either answer your questions as they come up or we'll answer them in the last 10 minutes. We'll share the slides after the quick bite, and then it'll be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So any questions, just pop them down below. Okay, so we'll get started with what is digital chaos. So when we talk about digital chaos, we're talking about being swamped down by too much information. So as you get started with your research and get really into the process, you might find that you have hundreds of documents and you don't know which one's which, or you can't find something that you know exists. And we're going to talk about how to get around that. So the way we approach it is that research chaos and digital chaos are both relying on each other. So when you get bogged down in looking at reading too many articles, that then leads to having too many articles. And if you create one strategy, you can get around them that way. We want you to basically do what works best for you, because you know how your workflow operates and what you'll do and what you won't do. And basically, if you start managing your information as early as possible, you can avoid having chaos, basically. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about
That's the theory anyway.
The theory, yeah. So we're going to talk about managing data and evidence to formulate a critical argument. So, Nick.
Well, I imagine we've got people listening from various different disciplines. So the first thing I should make clear, Tess, is that I'm from the history department.
Yes.
So there's going to be a particular disciplinary bias in what I'm saying, I suspect. And the first thing I would say is that there's always a reason for looking at what you are examining. So the first thing to bear in mind, and I'm probably going to say this from several different angles, I think, is that you should always be thinking in terms of the project that you're working on and have an idea or an objective in mind as you're reading things. And the way this discussion divides itself for most of the conversations that I have with students is in terms of primary sources and secondary sources. And this is the thing that really gets people confused. And that's where I would make this caveat. It may be a little bit different in other disciplines, but certainly in history, the thing that we're always asking students to do is to examine primary documents with the objective of coming up with an independent argument. So that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And there are ways of doing that. And the first thing that confronts everybody is the sense that there is an ocean of information and evidence out there. And so people feel that they're going to wade into it and lose their way.
Yes.
So what we're really talking about is having a kind of roadmap to guide you. So I can go on talking about this if you like, or
sure.
You can ask me a particular sort of question. So
keep going, and if any questions come up.
One of the first things I would say, I'm old enough to be allowed dad humor. So there are bad jokes that inform just about every conversation I have with people. One of them is that there are only first priorities when you're doing a history project. Number one priority is to get your mind around the secondary sources that you need to look at. And these, of course, are the works, in our case, written by other historians, but they might be sociologists or literary critics, it doesn't matter. And so you need to be across all of the material that you're using for a particular topic, that goes without saying, because you need that for context and background and all those sorts of things. So that's number one priority. But your real number one priority, we would say, and this is where the joke that isn't very funny comes in, is your primary evidence. Because for a historian, and I would say for most people in the humanities, that's where you're going to find the material that will fuel an independent argument. And it doesn't matter what discipline you're working in the humanities, you are always trying to make an argument, and you're trying to do it on the basis of your own independent thought. And you're not going to find that so much in secondary sources. You find that in the documents because you are having a direct encounter with the raw material, as it were, of your topic. So, jokes aside, the very serious message is to read critically in primary evidence, and this might be documents, it might be visual material, it doesn't have to be text, but you have a direct engagement with that kind of material. And because you are reading critically, you are always asking questions. And those questions are going to be the basis of the argument that drives your research further. You might call that the basis of a plan. So if you're talking about plan or you're talking about critical questions, you're talking about the same sorts of thing. So that's why one of the things that I always tell people, both literally and metaphorically, is that they should have a pen or pencil in their hands. It might be a device, it might be a laptop, it doesn't matter. But you never read without recording your thoughts as you go. So that would be my very first message, that you have documents that are in the area of your interest. Very often at university they've been prescribed for you. If you're in first and second year in particular, you usually have been given things to look at. And you should also be reading your secondary evidence, but as I say, it's the primary evidence that's going to be the engine room of your independent thinking. And this is related to avoiding chaos, because once you have read a certain amount of that kind of material and you've asked questions of it, you will get a sense of what the authors, the people who have produced this evidence, are most concerned about. And this is the basis of your interest. That's where the second part comes in. When you go and look at secondary evidence, you are therefore looking for material that will corroborate what you're doing, so give confirmation to the ideas that you have drawn out of the evidence. You will find context and background as well. So you will find maybe confirmation of ideas. If a historian writes that the kinds of things you seem to be asking questions are on the right track, you've got confirmation. You might find other evidence that gives corroboration of that as well, so more ballast for your argument. You might find that your thinking is misguided. There are, of course, reading documents in isolation may sometimes lead you to make false suppositions. In that case, the secondary sources will put you on the right road, and that's also a good thing. But one of the best things about working in this way, as far as I'm concerned, which is privileging the primary material, looking for confirmation, background, context, and so on in the secondary sources, is it gets you away from one of those really big problems that does create chaos as well as frustration and worry. I actually asked at a lecture theatre, because I was talking about exactly this in one of my units of study only last week. I asked people to raise their hands if they'd had the experience of reading a book by a historian and found that the idea that they thought they were going to write their essay about had already been thought by somebody else. And everybody in the room, of course, raised their hands. So you have this feeling of being preempted sometimes. If you follow the kind of procedure I'm talking about, you do not have that problem. It's a bold thing to say that you've got a cure, but this really is a cure for that problem. If you are asking your questions about the evidence that you are interested in, and then you go and find that a secondary author has written the same kind of analysis as you haven't been preempted. What you've got is confirmation of your argument. The reason this is good in terms of structuring your work is it means that if you've developed your own critical ideas, you know the kinds of things you are looking for in secondary sources. So suddenly you don't have an ocean to read. It would be lovely to read everything. Nobody's got time. You tell yourself on the basis of questions and conclusions and hypotheses that you have drawn on the basis of your primary reading that you do need to read A, B, and C, but other things are not relevant to you. So you may find a particular pile of secondary books is suddenly less important or not important at all. So you can give yourself a reading list which is targeted towards the objects of your interest. So you see the whole point about this is it's driving forward your thoughts, your arguments, and therefore telling you what you need. Yeah. So I hope that sort of makes sense in the abstract.
So following on from what Nick just said about writing with a pen in your hand, there are a bunch of really great pieces of software that you can use to keep track of everything as you go. So we recommend rather programs like Scrivener, OneNote, Google Docs, and Evernote. Like we were saying before, you pick one that works for you and you roll with it. But one really important thing is that you keep really good practices with writing. So you give things titles. If possible, you give them tags. That way you won't read an article in your first year of study and then come back to it 3 years later and wonder what it was. And depending on what you find interesting, you could record data, you could record quotes. As long as you keep it consistent, you should be able to come back to those sorts of things. And that kind of follows on to a little bit of folder work. So if you structure either your cloud-based filing system or your actual computer in a way that logically organizes your information, you'll be able to find it later on. So if you have a look at the slide, what I've just done is make folders for each chapter of my hypothetical thesis and put in maybe like an argument and then articles and notes separately. So even this type of architecture can help you from, or rather prevent you from getting lost further down the track, which is really key, especially when you are doing like a HDR research situation where you're going to be doing that for the next couple of years. You want to avoid as much stress as possible. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is identifying evidence and secondary material to support your independent research.
Well, I've said quite a bit about that already. In principle, one of the things I'd say on the back of what you've just said, Tess, is that it really doesn't matter what kind of system you have, as long as you're consistent in using it.
Yeah.
And that is perhaps the most important message I'm hearing in what you say about specific systems. So whether you use Evernote or Scrivener or what are the other ones? I don't like OneNote. I've told you that's
yes, I've heard that.
That's a personal opinion. It doesn't matter what you're using. There's another really good one as well, which is a hard copy journal with covers on it and pages in it. And that is also just as useful. It depends on what you prefer.
Yeah.
And so you find out what works for you, and you probably find over time that certain things cease to be useful and you prefer others, so you'll change over time. But generally, you should just work systematically and consistently. And which particular system you follow matters much less than the fact that you've got an established practice. One thing I would say in terms of software, is it too early to talk about software?
No.
One of the things I like about programs such as Scrivener and OneNote, OneNote is available both for PC people and for Mac users. One thing I like about them is that they are very, very open. As soon as you squirrel something away in a subfolder, you've got to remember that you put it there.
Yes.
And if you haven't used Scrivener, do have a look. Again, it's available on both the major platforms. It allows you to write down your thoughts anywhere and have them accessible afterwards, because you can find them on you don't even have to worry about keywords. You just search on terms that you know are there.
Yeah.
And they also allow you to, I can't give you examples here because it's not in front of us and we don't have time, but they both allow you to structure things in very loose ways that you can change. So going back to that idea of working your thoughts out by critically questioning your evidence, you might decide early on a certain series of themes is relevant, and as you go on, those ideas change, and they should. If your ideas aren't changing as you do research, that means your ideas aren't developing, so change is good. But as they change, you might think a different structure is relevant. You might want to put information literally in a different place. And both of those programs allow you to do that very, very easily as well. Evernote will work in a similar kind of way. I find it a little clumsier for that. But there are, all of those programs in some degree or other are very, very open in their architecture. Yeah. And that's really useful as well.
So what, Nick, we're going so well with the flow. What Nick said about if your research isn't developing, you're not doing research, ties really neatly into what I'm about to say. So when you are finding evidence to back up your research, or you're coming up with an argument, if you find one key article, you can actually sort of farm that for things that are interesting or useful. So if you have an article that uses a certain amount of keywords, or if you're in one of the more STEMmy areas, subject headings, even concepts and ideas or authors or journals, you can then take that out and put that into your next search. And what that does is it helps you grow your search as well as your understanding, because searching is very iterative. So what that means is you're not going to do the same database search on day one of your PhD thesis to the day that it's being handed in. Like, there will be differences.
You really hope not.
You really hope not.
Yeah.
But if you continually take notes on what you find and you put that back into your research process, you'll start to notice that you're actually building your knowledge and finding a lot more useful evidence. So basically, once you've done that, you use that as background information. Even if you read a Wikipedia article to gather an understanding of something and then put that into what you find next, just getting the keywords and stuff.
You want me to tell you what I think about Wikipedia in general for
we don't have
university?
Time.
No, we haven't got time. I can be very quick and reasonably scathing if you like.
Maybe if we have time for questions.
Yes.
But you use that to brainstorm what you need to know and what you already know. So you can plot where you need to go with your research. And again, this comes from taking notes. Okay, so now we're going to talk about managing and using large amounts of secondary materials.
Which flows from talking about taking notes, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And I have something very specific to say about taking notes. And okay. I look at my own self more years ago than I care to remember as an undergraduate, taking very careful, detailed notes from secondary works and often sort of tabulating what the author was saying so that I'd get a nice summary of what a particular chapter or article contained. And part of me now looks back at myself and says, what a waste of time. Because, and I did learn from this, so it didn't stay the same way, but the initial impulse is to try to take a record of what somebody else has written.
Yeah.
And that's not really what you want to do, because the article is there and it's even more available than it was in the Stone Age when I was doing my undergraduate degree, because we now have computers and digital sources, which is what this is all about. You can have the article and sometimes the book on your computer, so it's literally at your fingertips.
Yes.
And that means that you can always go back very easily and read the article again if you want the information. What I think is important to do with note-taking is to make that an active process of inquiry as well. So if you are reading, and this is where it is similar to reading documents, if you're reading a secondary author, that's often going to trigger thoughts that you might have about the project on what you're working on. Do not trust to memory to remember those brilliant thoughts that you're having.
No.
You write them down. And that has an influence on the kind of notes you write. They should be reflections about your own thinking in relation to the secondary author. So you don't just take down the information. It might be very important to do that, of course. You do need certain facts and so on. I'm not saying you ignore information, but more important even than that is to keep a record of your thinking. And that's where the idea of a journal comes in, or any of these other software packages where you are recording the evolution of your thought. That's what you want.
Yeah.
And so when you're writing about the thoughts that are triggered by a particular author, and you're writing those thoughts in light of the critical questions you've asked of your primary evidence, then you're on the way to writing argument.
Yeah.
And once again, this is a way of finding a way through a complicated thicket of information. So you might have a lot of evidence to look at. This is a way through it. Yeah. And it gives you a kind of linear process to find your way through a lot of information.
Yeah.
So critically questioning and writing reflections on what I think about what that author wrote. That's really what matters.
Okay. So changing track a little bit, I'm going to talk about naming conventions. So we were talking about having lots of different types of information, and another way you can sort of keep track of where it is by giving it a name that's easily recognizable. So if you have a look at the slides, these are 4 articles about nutrition and kids, basically. But what I've done is I've put in the surname of the author, the year it was published, and a quick summary of what the article's about. So that at a glance, if you've been really absorbed or involved in the literature, you'll be able to look at that and know what it is, who it's by, and what arguments it uses. So
I actually do a version of that myself.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, so a little bit different, but basically the same principle.
So I didn't just make it up. That's good. But if you have something that's immediately recognizable, you can use that to avoid being stuck with a million different articles with the default download name. And that in your downloads folder as well is just a nightmare waiting to happen. So if you utilize both the architecture using the folders and the file naming system, you can get around any future headaches. This also would apply to if you have backups as well. It's really important, especially...
What do you mean if you have backups?
Yeah.
What do you mean if?
When you have backups. It's really important, especially like Nick was saying about taking notes and always writing how you feel about the articles. If you just add like version names, or if you add just don't call it final, notes 1, notes 2, because that's just chaos waiting to happen. So if you give your files smart names, they'll be easily found as well. And if you have some programs allow you to like give them tags or change the color of stuff, so that, I mean, it helps in another way as well. There's also, if you use a reference manager like EndNote or Zotero or Mendeley, you can use them to both store your references and keep track of what they are. So if you have a look at that, one way that you might organize your references in EndNote is by determining what chapter they're going into and if you've read them or not. Another popular thing people do is like they have folders for the databases they've used, so things that come out of Scopus, things that come out of Medline, etc. It's especially useful if you have to conduct some type of systematic literature search. So keeping track of where things are now stops you from having to remember where they are later, which you can do, but it's not ideal. And again, as long as there's no required file names or folder names, as long as you come up with something that works for you in the long run, that's all right.
Can I tell you what I do on that score?
Yeah.
Every PDF file I have on my computer, and these are usually scholarly articles, and there are hundreds of them on my computer, I file them by surname, given name, underscore, title. And the only order I give them is alphabetical, by surname. And they all sit there in an alphabetical series of folders. And the way I keep track of what's in them is, again, in relation to the project. So this may not make any sense to anybody who doesn't use Zotero, but I use Zotero for the categories that I want to put the information in. So if you know Zotero, this will make sense to you. That you can have folders and subfolders, and you can have a single item located in as many different places as you like. So it's like an album, isn't it? And so if I'm working on a particular chapter for a book or something, I will drag the Zotero entry for that item into that folder, which means it's still in the general category, but it's also in that folder. I might use the same article for teaching, so it gets dragged into a particular folder related to that unit of study. And that means when I go back to the folders related to the particular project, there it is. Yeah. And I find it on the computer by going back to its surname.
Yeah, exactly.
So it stays in the one place. And having a single copy of something is very important, isn't it?
And Marguerite has said that you can use the same process with EndNote, which is true. So EndNote, and I think also a couple of other ones like RefWorks and Mendeley let you do it too. Yeah. It's a really good habit of getting into, and it just helps you again in the long run.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about distinguishing vital evidence from huge amounts of sources. So we've covered a lot of this already, actually.
Yeah. But there are lots of different ways of saying the same thing.
There are.
Which doesn't hurt. So we're talking about, the reason I'm looking sideways is because I'm reading the screen, distinguishing vital evidence from large amounts of primary resources. Yeah, we have talked about that. And I suppose another aspect of that process I was describing at the very beginning, which is working out what you think by, we were saying really by reading and writing. So I'm saying in one sense, right from the very beginning. I'll say what I was about to say in a moment. To sum up that early advice, I'm telling people to, and people say this in different ways, of course, but my particular way of saying this is start writing from the beginning, by which I do not mean writing essay drafts. I don't mean it has to be formal, but those reflective pieces, those ideas, write them down. And it can be as badly expressed as you like, as long as the thought is there. So in this early phase, don't fetishize good style. Do not worry about that. It's much more important to record the thoughts and then to think about them later, and then you'll pull them into a different shape as you go forward. Yeah. And I think the other point that was looming has disappeared from my brain, but it may come back in a moment.
It'll come up to you.
Or not.
Who knows? So moving on quickly, because we're running out of time.
I've remembered what it is.
What is it?
It's important. It's to trust your judgment. I think there's often a tendency for undergraduates in particular to think that they have to accept the authority of secondary authors in particular. Now, if you read that the Battle of Hastings was in 1066 and you decide, no, you know better, it's happened in 2018, that's probably not a good idea.
No.
But if you have a particular idea about your evidence that you want to write about and theorize about, you should have the confidence to do it, because the one thing you can say is that your critical faculty is as good as anybody else's when you are reading this evidence. So part of this business of writing things down, recording your ideas, knocking them into shape in terms of developing an argument or a plan, is to believe in your own critical faculty, have the confidence to do it. And don't think that you have to absorb every idea from a secondary source. It's much better, as we're saying, to think independently on the basis of the evidence. That means you need to have the confidence to do so, and you should.
Yeah.
As a person marking essays, that's what I most get excited about seeing. It's when somebody has tried an idea out on the basis of evidence.
Excellent. Okay. So we've already talked about using naming conventions to categorize articles on their evidence. So that's great. And one thing that's another method that a lot of people use when they are evaluating if something is good or not is using evaluating or appraisal tools. So there are some really general ones like the CRAP test or the review criteria.
Yeah, I worry about that one. Not having heard of it before I spoke to you last week.
Yeah, well, there you go. It's not applicable to every article, but there's also some, for instance, if you're in medicine or health, there's criteria like CASP, which are a checklist that you go through. Or if you come up with your own criteria, you can apply that to an article you find. So if you, for instance, want something that's by, I'm not an academic, so I don't know, but if you pick certain things that you want in an article and you stick to it, that's a systematic process of selecting your evidence, which is an excellent way of approaching things. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, you can pop them in the comment box, I guess, but it's been quite...
I can see people whose name I know.
Oh, excellent.
Just typing comments. This is a bit scary.
If you... So do you have any advice for someone who's nearing the end of their thesis and realizing they should have been using EndNote all along?
No, you should not think that.
No.
I said that
particularly for referencing. Yeah. Is it worth the time to do it now? It depends on how close I think you are to the end of your thesis, but it's never too late to do something like that, but it can be a lot of work. EndNote does work better when you start really early, but you can still import things from a database search, or you can actually drag PDFs in, copy the DOI, and it will add stuff in automatically. Yeah. You can also, if you have in another referencing manager, you can export it across, but I wouldn't say it's too late. I'd just say that you have to be really committed to doing it. Like set yourself like a Sunday afternoon or something to just get everything in EndNote, because
if you're coming to the end of a thesis, it's going to take more than enough.
Yeah, that's true. That was optimistic. Yeah. But it depends on, it's a case by case situation. You can always come in and chat to your librarian if you need some help.
Yeah.
The next question says, to what discipline does the CRAP test align? It's more like a general kind of social science humanities thing, as far as I know.
I'd never heard of it until I spoke to you.
We teach it, librarians teach it a lot to undergraduate students. But it's one of those things where it tests for currency, relevance, authority, and purpose. But if you find that there are certain extra things you want to include, you can also develop your own ones. Emma, who asked the question about EndNote, says she has 6 months, which I think is a good amount of time. Good luck. I believe in you. Not in a sarcastic way, I genuinely do.
And think about Zotero. If you're thinking EndNote, think about Zotero.
There you go. What is the best way for naming multiple versions of a file? So generally, you can just pop an underscore at the end and go like V1, V2, V1.2, or however. If you have a practice we do here is we have like a separate folder for different, so like for past versions go in a folder and the current version stays outside the folder. You can also, it's mostly something that makes sense to you. That's kind of a cop-out answer, but as long as you'll be able to recognize in the future that something's a previous version, even if you just have past versions stored off.
Or the date.
The date is a good one too, especially with stuff like EndNote libraries, because they can change day by day. As long as you put like version 1, 29th of October, you'll know what that is and you know what you did on that day. So we've hit half an hour. Thank you for coming to this with us, I guess. if you have any questions, you can always send me an email. I am tess8can@sydney.edu.au. If I can't answer your question, I'll pass you on to someone who does. And someone's just asked if you can reply this online, and we will record it, do some editing and chopping and stuff, and put it on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to look at it there. But any further questions, just send me an email, I guess. And good luck with everything. You'll do great.